By the time the USA ended World War II, it had the strongest army on Earth, and above all, it was the only nuclear country. Hence, the US government had no strong interest in missiles or space. The going mindset was like,
why should we care at all? We have atomic bombs and the best planes.
The US had planes which could enter deep into Soviet Union territory undetected. The US government didn't have a strong fear of the Soviet Union. You may even say that there was no fear at all. All this changed in 1949 when the Soviet Union announced the conduction of their first successful atomic explosion test. From this moment on, a competition started between the US and the Soviet Union in two main areas. The first area is who has more atomic bombs, and the second area is who has the best planes to move these bombs and drop them accurately in the territories of the other country. In both areas, the US earned its first place with light years apart from the Soviet Union. This is what frightened the leaders of the Soviet Union, specifically the Soviet Union leader at that time, Nikita Khrushchev, who ultimately found that the solution and salvation for the security of the Soviet Union would only be in the German missile program.
Hi there, this is Bassem Fawzi from World Economy. In this video, we'll talk about the most important and most dangerous weapons program at the beginning of the Cold War.
The Missile Development Program.
This program was very important for both the Soviet Union and the US, but it was particularly more important for the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union at that time was a technologically backward country where agriculture was the main economic activity. So, how could they possess the technology necessary to initiate their missile development program?
This is what we would unveil in this video. So if you like this type of content, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, as your subscription helps us to keep providing this content.
So, I told you earlier that the competition between the Soviet Union and the USA in the first place was over who had more atomic bombs. In terms of numbers, by 1955, the Soviet Union had about 100 atomic bombs, while the United States had 20 times that number, owning around 2,000 atomic bombs. And every year, this number doubled, to the point that in 1961, the USA had 23,000 nuclear warheads. So the Soviet Union didn't stand a chance against the USA in this competition. The second competition was over which country had the best planes to fly these bombs and throw them accurately in the areas of the other country. And once again, the USA was superior thanks to the Boeing B-47 airplane. The B-47 was a long-range plane that could fly at very high altitudes and was able to evade Soviet radars. And most importantly, it was able to refuel during flight. The USA had 2,000 of these bombs, which was confirmed by Kurt Solomon, who worked as general of the USA Air Force at that time. He stated that the USA had the ability to destroy 118 out of 134 of the largest populated industrial centers in the Soviet Union. According to Curtis May, who was a famous US pilot at that time, it was expected that more than 77 victims would have fallen in case a war would have broken between the US and the Soviets, including 60 million dead. And all of this would have happened with the help of the B-47 and the 23,000 nuclear warheads which the US had at that time. Then the USA introduced a new plane with a range of 8,800 miles, that's about 14,000 kilometers. This made the US feel a sense of ultimate superiority. They were thinking, that's it, we don't even need a military base close to the Soviet Union. We don't even need to refuel our planes mid-flight. We have a flying beast, and this beast is called the B-52. The B-52 at that time was a terrifying monster that has made it very difficult for the Soviet Union to keep up with the USA. The Soviets were not competing against the US government. They were competing against the US capitalism and the companies that stood behind it. The US at that time spent 9% of its gross domestic product, known as GDP, on its military efforts, while the Soviet Union spent somewhere between 14 to 20% of their GDP on its military efforts. Yet, the Soviets couldn't keep up with the Americans, simply because 9% of the US GDP at 1960, for example, was worth $49 billion, while 15% of the Soviet Union GDP at the same year was worth only $22 billion. In hope to make up for the difference in spending, the Soviets kept an army of 3.5 million soldiers. Just think about how much they had to pay to feed these soldiers, provide cloth and military equipment. In addition to that, they had to pay to keep and maintain thousands of tanks, airplanes, and ships. Even after all these efforts, the Soviets still couldn't keep up with the USA, let alone to have the higher hand in terms of firepower. This is what many Soviet leaders confirmed at that time. The solution wasn't to spend more on traditional firepower. The only solution was to use advanced technology to turn on the table. Then, the Soviets revisited the research papers they had stolen from the Germans during World War II. Then they rediscovered the V-2 missile, which Hitler had high hopes on it to help him put the English to their knees. Hitler had a lot of trust in the success of this weapon that he ordered his engineers to build him thousands of copies. Add a nuclear bomb on top of the missile and you get a mass destruction weapon. A nuclear missile. That was the magical solution for the Soviets' firepower problem. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviets' head at that time, thought that these missiles were the cheapest and most effective way to keep the Soviets in the international game of power. He was true about that. The Soviets didn't need to make thousands of missiles. They only needed a few missiles with nuclear warheads to destroy all Western countries. So, Khrushchev, among other members of the Communist Party, decided to visit the Soviet secret missile lab to meet the chief of the country's missile program. The chief of the country's missile program presented to Khrushchev and the Communist Party members the R-2 missile. The R-2 missile was simply a revamped version of the German V-2 missile after making a lot of modifications to the original version. Khrushchev was very impressed with the R-2 missile. In his diary, Khrushchev said,
"The party members and myself were technologically ignorant and couldn't understand how that piece of metal works. We were spinning around the missile as if we were like sheep. We put our hands on the missile and knocked it to check its durability."
When the chief engineer noticed Khrushchev's impression of the R-2, he wanted to make Khrushchev more greedy. The chief engineer had his own plans, which we will discover shortly. The chief engineer decided to take Khrushchev and the party members to another missile lab. But this lab had a different missile model. This lab had the R-5 missile, the first missile to be fully designed and made by the Soviets. The R-5 was totally different from its predecessor, the German V-2 missile. The R-5 was twice as big as the V-2 missile, more pointy and capable of loading nuclear warheads that could cause 6 times the destruction caused by the bomb thrown on Hiroshima in Japan. The party members were very focused on their revolutionary new weapon. All of them were amazed by how this strange object could produce such immense power with just the press of a button. They started envisioning the cities this missile could target and completely destroy. There was a profound silence for a while, as the chief designer watched the faces of the party members. To break the silence, Khrushchev himself asked,
"Which cities can this missile reach and destroy?"
The chief designer answered,
All of Europe except Spain and Portugal.
Khrushchev said,
"Great. How many missiles would it take to destroy England, for example?"
The designer replied.
5.
Then Khrushchev said,
"Just 5?
The designer confirmed.
Yes, just 5, and it would almost wipe it out.
This made the Soviet leader very pleased. Since the cost of 5 missiles was nothing, compared to the budgets they were spending at that time. The Soviet leader asked,
Can we extend the range of this missile?
The chief designer replied very cleverly,
No, unfortunately, this is our limit. We can't do more than this.
This response started to make the party members feel disappointed. The party members, including Khrushchev, really wanted a missile that could reach the USA. That was their main goal. Again, silence took over the room, and it seemed like they were about to give up and leave. At that moment, the chief designer spoke up and said,
Look, extending the range of the R-5 missile is impossible, but we have something even more powerful.
Khrushchev's face lit up, and he and all the party members became very excited. The chief designer then took them to another location to see a different missile. As they were walking, he told them,
You have seen the past and present of Soviet Union missiles. Now I would like to introduce you to the future of missiles for the entire world, the R-7 missile. This missile is capable of reaching a range of 8,000 kilometers.
This meant it could easily reach the USA in less than half an hour. Even if the Americans saw the missile coming, they wouldn't be able to do anything about it. The party members couldn't believe what they were hearing. It brought them back to life. This missile was about 10 times the size of the R-5 they had just seen, 40 times faster than the German V-2 missile, and it was the biggest and most powerful missile on Earth. It was capable of causing an explosion nearly 100 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. You can imagine the scene. The party members stood in complete silence, each of them dreaming that all of their problems with the USA were now solved, and there would be no more fear of the Americans. In the midst of this silence and the intense joy in the eyes of the party members, which the chief engineer was observing, trying to invest the excitement of the party members, the chief engineer said,
Now I want to show you something else.
The president and the party members with him were about to burst with excitement as they were expecting an even bigger missile. He took them to a small corner in the same place and showed them a small sphere. Then he said,
This object in front of you is my lifelong dream. I just want your approval to work on this project. Everything I showed you so far was only to convince you of this metallic sphere.
Khrushchev and the party members were not very interested in this little sphere, and the chief designer noticed he was losing their attention.
This sphere was the first satellite in history.
The chief engineer then said,
By the way, America is also developing a satellite and plans to launch it soon. If we do it first, we will score a point over the USA and capitalism.
This made Khrushchev regain interest, since the USA was also interested. Then Khrushchev said,
But this will delay our missile program, which is more important to us.
The chief designer replied,
It won't delay anything. You see the R-7 missile? Instead of carrying a nuclear warhead, we can use it to carry the satellite into space. It's designed to go beyond the Earth's atmosphere and place the satellite in its orbit.
At that time, very few people understood the future of satellites.
Even the Americans didn't care much about it. The US President and Congress at that time thought that space exploration was just science fiction. When they initially knew that the Soviets were planning to venture into space, they said,
Let them do whatever they want. Ha 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 ha.
No one really knew what satellites were or their importance at all. Despite all that, President Khrushchev agreed to fund the space program because he was very pleased with what the chief designer was doing. He gave the green light on one condition, that the space program wouldn't affect the missile program. This was the happiest moment in the chief designer's life.
But also the most dangerous. But why was it the most dangerous?
Simply because in reality, there was no such thing as an R-7 missile, nor was there anything close to it. All the party members had seen was just a giant prototype. The party members thought that the missile was ready to be used, but in reality, it was nothing. To actually build the R7, it would require an enormous amount of extremely hard and complex efforts, with a very high chance of failure. If the missile wasn't built, the chief designer would be sent back to where he came from, the Gulag camps in Siberia. This chief designer was Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, the other key player in the global missile game. He was the other half of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. He was unjustly thrown into the Gulag camps in Siberia before World War II. When the German von Braun developed the V-2 missile, the Soviets began searching for someone who could understand what the Germans had done. They were looking for a mind that could match von Braun's intellect. And they found no one else but this man, who could truly match and even surpass von Braun.
So, what's the story of this man? Would he be the one who would make the Soviet Union stand up against the Americans? That's what we will find out in a later video, and I'll make sure to leave the link for this video in the description box down below.